Hi everyone, Miss Clingan here, and I'm back for part 3 of the Twits. I hope you've enjoyed the last 2 parts. I don't think this couple are very nice. Do you? Let's read part 3 and see what happens. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons, and the upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit. And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and it let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up, he gasped, he gaped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Ugh," he said, "Oh, ouch!" "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll wash you to a swizzle. I'll nash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. The house, the tree, and the monkey cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison, and not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out nasty, nosy little children." Near the house, you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side, there is the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You will hear about them later. Wow, that was an eventful part of the book, wasn't it? My goodness, that poor woman. But then again, did she deserve it? I'm not sure. What do you think? What do you think will happen in the next part of the book? They've got a monkey cage with 4 monkeys. What's that all about? What's going to happen with them? Goodness me, I'm so excited to read the next part with you. But until then, make sure you're staying safe and staying happy and healthy and behaving for your parents and carers. Join me next time for part 3 of the Twits. See ya. Bye.